So welcome back after our wonderful plenary session. So this is panel 4, Human Rights, Law and Social Justice. So we've got 3 papers, and I think about 20 minutes per paper, and then a bit of time for questions at the end. And we'll be starting off with Shapeless Shapes and Justice for the Stateless in Times of Crisis, from Hanna Kim and Amal the Chickera. If you want to take it away, 20 minutes or so.
Sure. Let me share my screen first, if that's all right. Can everybody see my screen? Perfect. I see some nodding. Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Hanna Kim, and I am here with my dear friend Amal de Chickera to speak about our collaborative project, Shapeless Shapes. We are really excited to be here. So thank you, Graphic Justice Research Alliance, for giving us this opportunity. Shapeless Shapes is a graphic narrative about a little-known human rights issue called statelessness. For some of you, this could be the first time hearing this word. Basically, someone who is stateless does not have a nationality or citizenship in any country, meaning that statelessness sort of renders people invisible in the eyes of the law. And people are not counted or recognized like a citizen would be. So it is actually one of the most acute and overlooked human rights violations. There are more than 15 million stateless people in the world. And because stateless people are not included in most countries' COVID-19 responses, they are essentially left in the dark during a global pandemic. So right now, stateless people are more vulnerable than ever. So how did an artist like myself and a human rights lawyer like Amal decide to write a book together? Well, I learned about statelessness, which reminded me of when I lost my permanent residency card. Imagine losing your passport or your important identity papers. You'd be really stressed out, right? Stateless people are kind of stuck in this legal limbo, sometimes for a lifetime. I started thinking about how art and design could make this little known and very complex issue more accessible to the public. And of course, I'm not an expert in statelessness by any means, so I soon hit a wall in my research. Then I met Amal, who took an interest in my ideas. As the co-director of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, he really helped articulate the narratives underlying statelessness. So Shapeless Shapes, as you see on the screen, looks like a children's book, colorful, written in plain language, and short, but it actually tries to untangle the complex landscape that creates statelessness. So we hope that this book will serve to bring justice to the stateless communities around the world. So this is how we've structured our presentation. We will start by reading some pages from the book to give you an idea on how we've translated the issue of statelessness through a metaphor of shapes. Then Amal will talk more in depth about the mechanisms behind statelessness. And we will end by sharing about our roles as artist activist and lawyer activist. The entire book is available for purchase and also as a free digital download. So if you like our presentation, which I hope you do, you can head on over to institutesi.org to access the full book. So Amal, will you start us off with the reading?
Thanks, Hanna. And what we're going to do is I'm actually going to read some sentences up which are about statelessness, and Hanna is going to show you how we've translated those ideas into the metaphor of shapes. So let me begin. The world was full of citizens.
The world was full of shapes.
Citizens belonged in their own countries.
Shapes belonged with their own kind.
And all the citizens lived happily ever after.
And all the shapes lived happily ever after. But no, this is not a fairy tale. Things are not so simple.
In this world of states and citizens live some people who were deemed to be stateless.
In this world of shapes lived some shapes who were deemed to be shapeless.
To the untrained eye, they looked just like citizens. But whenever they were asked to prove their citizenship, they could not.
To the untrained eye, they looked just like other shapes. But whenever they were asked to prove their shapeliness, they could not.
How do you prove you are a citizen if you have no papers saying which nationality you have, or if your papers say you are stateless?
How do you prove you are a shape if you have no papers saying which shape you are, or if your papers say you are shapeless?
Most people do not even know they are stateless until the authorities ask them to prove their citizenship.
Most did not even know they were shapeless until the shape police asked them to prove it.
Now, just as a citizenship can be obtained, a citizenship can also be denied or stripped away.
But just as some shapes are given, some shapes can be taken away.
Take the case of Nepalis living in beautiful Nepal.
Take the case of the trapezoids living in the wonderful trapezoidea.
Nepali women don't have equal rights with men to pass their citizenship on to their children.
Mother trapezoids are not allowed to pass on their shapes to their babies. Only fathers are.
So if the father is out of the picture or is himself stateless, the baby's Nepali citizenship is denied.
So if the father is out of the picture or is himself shapeless, the baby's shape is erased.
Today, many stateless people live in Nepal.
Today, many shapeless trapezoids live there.
Then there are the Dominicans of Haitian origin.
Then there are the hexagons of unity and strength.
Haitians living in Haiti have Haitian citizenship.
Those who live in Hexaland have their shapes.
But many migrated generations ago to neighboring Dominican Republic to work on their sugarcane plantations.
But many went to neighboring Pentaland to work on their bee farms.
Over generations, the Dominicans of Haitian origin contributed to make the Dominican Republic more wealthy and prosperous.
Over generations, the hexagons contributed to making Pentaland wealthy and prosperous.
But as they were perceived to look different, they were ridiculed by the Dominicans.
But as they looked different, they were always ridiculed by the Pentagons.
Over time, ridicule grew into hatred.
And over time, the ridicule became fear and hatred.
One day, the Dominican Republic decided to strip Dominicans of Haitian origin of their citizenship.
One day, the Pentagons decided to erase the hexagon's shapes.
They made them stateless, just like that.
They made them shapeless, just like that.
Some people have their citizenship stripped because they have acted against national security interests.
Some shapes were erased because they had acted against their land.
Or because they were suspected as having done so.
Or because they were suspected of having done so.
Or because they actually love their people and are courageous human rights defenders and dissidents, speaking truth to power.
Or because they actually loved their land very much and bravely opposed the powerful shapes who took control.
It has been said that a person should never have their citizenship stripped as a punishment, but this still happens.
It has been said that a shape should never be stripped of its shape as a punishment, but this still happens.
Worst of all, the children of stateless people can also be born stateless.
Worst of all, the babies of shapeless shapes can also be born shapeless.
And all the stateless people lived miserably ever after.
And all the shapeless shapes lived miserably ever after. But no, this is not a history book. The struggle goes on. Take it away, Amal.
Thanks, Hanna. So this is just it's some excerpts from the book with the wider context of statelessness layered on top of that. And as you can see, what we've tried to do is articulate in very simple terms and simple language some rather complex ideas and technical issues around statelessness. And Hanna's genius metaphor of the shape and the idea of a shapeless shape, which is an impossibility, really helped us to capture the essence of this. But what Hanna and I realized as we started off on this journey together to actually present in simple terms for lay people quite a complex issue was that the metaphor was actually useful for us as well in helping us to understand and unpack some of the complexities around statelessness itself. So the fact that statelessness isn't a straightforward technical issue, but there is underlying discrimination, underlying prejudice, and a whole host of societal reasons as to why people are made stateless and why statelessness is perpetuated, the power structures and dynamics behind statelessness, which keep the issue kind of growing and mean that there is no political solution for a problem which really should be solvable very quickly by humans. But also it allowed us to think a little bit more about the roles of different activists and different groups, and the power of organization and mobilization and activism to fight for justice. And so if you have a look at the book as a whole, you will see that we structured it into these three parts. The first part, which kind of builds the world, and then the second part, which shows all the examples of the different shapes that are made shapeless, and ends on this slide. And then the third part, which really unpacks some of the underlying phenomena and looks at the future and the role of activism in addressing statelessness. And what I'd like to show you now is probably my favorite 4-page spread from the book, which unpacks some of these issues and shows how we relate it to wider kind of challenges around power, etc. So Hanna, if you don't mind just scrolling forward for me on the slides. Yeah, I'm just going to read this very quickly to you. So they say the pen is mightier than the sword. But when the pen and the sword work together, they are mightier still. Pens wrote away the shapes of some. Swords stopped them getting it back. The sword-bearing wordsmith shapes spoke loudest and used the most force. They used their power to spread fake news and rewrite history. They magnified their own shapes and erased others. The truth was no longer true. And then we had this double spread, which kind of captures all of this in this beautiful image that Hanna drew. And if we go on to the last slide, this is what the powerful shapes did. This was the dark reality that confronted the activist shapes. And then we go on in the book to kind of talk about the strategies that the activist shapes use to try and address this. So we've moved basically from quite a simplistic approach to actually using graphics and images and the metaphor of the shapes to tackle much more complex issues around activism, around kind of the conflation of both language and physical might, and how when both language and physical might is concentrated with the powerful, how that then becomes an extremely potent tool both to shape narratives and histories and to create its own truth and its own kind of self-reinforcing cycle, and how it's also used to penalize and punish those who try to fight against this. And I mean, we'd be very happy to talk more about how we went about doing this, if there are any questions on that as well. But I'm mindful of time, and I'd like to end by, as Hanna said, us just exploring a little our own personal journeys and our roles in kind of creating and developing this book. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a question to Hanna, and then if we have time, she's going to pose a question to me as well. If you don't have time for my question, that's fine. So Thomas, please stop us. And this is my question to Hanna. You are both an artist and an activist. Do these two roles always complement each other, or do they at times sit in tension with each other? In other words, does compelling art always translate into effective activism? And if not, where are you willing to compromise?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I think art and activism definitely can complement each other, and they have been more complementary in my work in recent years. But I've definitely felt those kind of tensions that you were asking about, for sure. And I have created projects that didn't quite achieve what I've envisioned as well. Since I work with people who are directly impacted, in this case by statelessness, I've learned to really kind of rethink my own privileges and bias as well. And what I used to view as a compromise, now I kind of know that that's a point of collaboration. And, there's definitely tension between my artist ego wanting something more beautiful or wanting something more clever. But through kind of collaborating with, stateless people and stateless activists, I've learned it is often not, if that's not really, it's not really about that, right? And I've learned that it's actually about sort of utilizing the potential of art and design, or, visual representation or a graphic narrative, to really give justice to the collective struggle. And so I've learned to become really flexible with many restraints. And I've come to believe that's actually where one can become really creative and artistic. But with that said, I would like to also add that, really sitting in that tension and working to kind of redefine what art and activism looks like is also a really commendable effort. And I think by, as an artist / activist, me kind of working with this area is also sort of allowing the society at large to continue redefining what art and activism looks like. So I think, having a really complementary relationship is great and it is important, but at the same time, the tension and exploring what that is and why there is tension is also really helpful in furthering the conversation. Yeah, and I think, do we have time for me to ask Amal a question?
Yeah, you got about a minute or two left.
Okay, perfect. So my question to Amal is, let me pull that up, sorry. So you are, or I would say, law is often associated with bureaucracy or impartiality, or kind of like the feeling of coldness. And for some people, law is something that is farthest from, being creative. But, you are an artist that often collaborates with artists. So would you have a different perspective on the relationship between law and creativity?
Thanks, Hanna. I mean, I would, in the interest of time as well, I would maybe make 3 very short bullet point type comments in regard to that question. The first is absolutely yes. I think creativity is a bedrock of the law, and it is, I mean, any good lawyer is creative and uses the law to their advantage. Any lawmaker is creative in trying to kind of address a problem or an issue through the law, and without creativity, the law wouldn't be effective. But the second point that I would like to make is that I think we tend to associate creativity with a moral good, and we attach a moral value that's positive to the idea of creativity, whereas I think creativity is a morally neutral notion. And so you find some of the most creative lawyers and the most creative laws actually being used for negative purposes. And that's certainly our experience working on the issue of statelessness and working with human rights defenders, etc., where we see laws being abused and interpreted in particular ways in order to actually crack down on people and dissent and human rights defenders. And then the third final point on which I would conclude is that this is exactly why it's important to use the law both creatively but also positively in order to address issues of social justice. And certainly collaborations with artists and activists have to be central to those efforts, as do collaborations with other lawyers and other types of stakeholders. So I will stop there, Thomas. I hope we've stuck to time. And both Hanna and I will be delighted to answer any questions you may have at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both hugely for that really interesting and then exciting talk. So next up is actually my paper on melancholia, lunar and legal in Thom Gould's Moon Cop. So I'll just see if I can share my screen. There we go. Can everyone see my slides? Brilliant. Okay. Okay. Set on the moon in the final days of the first lunar colony, Thom Gould's Moon Cop presents a vision of the dissipation of law. Across its 94 pages, Moon Cop articulates a powerful and lasting glimpse of the complex melancholia of the human and legal conditions, and of the hopeful possibility of a receding legality. In the opening frames of Moon Cop, the slow life of the moon colony is navigated by its unnamed police officer. As the dominant linear vector of the work's multi-frame unfolds, the people living on the moon gradually pack up and leave. As the Moon Cop encounters them, they each explain they are going back to Earth. This first order reading of the linear sequence of panels within the archive of Moon Cop's multiframe gives the first indications of the dissipation of law. It depicts the recession of civilization from its high watermark on the moon. But as a multiframe, as a database aesthetics, an atemporal archive of separable units, the images and panels of Moon Cop also constitute this vanishing gesture in their multivalent sets and subsets of connected units. Accordingly, this paper is concerned with a more detailed elaboration of the work's undoing of the melancholia of law on the moon. Each panel in the work sits amongst others, a frozen moment that can be lingered upon. Going by the sequential numbering of its pages, this is a lingering that the work invites from its opening inscriptions. In heraldry, it is Dexter Chief, the top left corner of an image from the viewer's perspective, that has prominence and can thus be said to carry a microcosm of the dominant messages of the image. Applying this principle to the archive of a comics multiframe, not only can we judge any particular frame in light of what is depicted in this primary location, but the archive as a whole can be judged in light of what first appears in its upper and leftmost regions. As a printed book, it is the opening pages that occupy this dominant position in the topography of a multiframe. In adopting this approach, it is the opening of a comics work that bears the interpretive brunt. And in Moon Cop, this results in the deepening awareness of the potential to read the work atemporally. The opening scenes are a collection of pillow panels showing buildings nestled in the lunar landscape, a scrapbook of snapshots, a study in the quiet of lunar life and the presence of human existence against the dead rock of the moon and the emptiness of space. These 3 pages follow an opening transition between empty space and moon. On the final page, the depiction of space returns, and the image is also used as punctuation between scenes. The wider context of the narrative is thus space itself, and given there are only 3 pages that do not contain the moon's starry sky, space not only acts as parentheses, but also sits immanently within the atemporal structure of the work itself. Encountering Moon Cop's multiframe outside the strictures of narrative movement reveals the work's inscribed lunar spaces to sit as statements of human and legal presence within the vastness of space. This atemporal perspective indicates the melancholic structure of law that rests on its paradoxical relation with the reality it seeks to regulate and results in an encounter with melancholia legal and lunar. We shall consider each in turn. There is always a divide between the world and the descriptions of law, between living individual and legal subject, between endless space and legal structure. Yet the real world is the animating principle of legality, resting as it does upon normative desire, the desire to alter the world towards a particular arrangement or way of being. Law is thus founded upon its distinction from reality, for if the world was already the way it should be, there would be no need for law. In this sense, law is a utopian dream, describing an idealized world and then oscillating between the general abstraction of the ideal and its specific application in cases where the world deviates from it. The law in its principles and institution is thus melancholic, always holding on to a world that never was, that is imagined as an absence at the heart of law itself. This legal melancholy is a distinctly Freudian one. As Freud defines it, melancholy is related to an object which is withdrawn from consciousness, in which the ego itself has become poor and empty. As Tacit explains, melancholy is a game of shadows. The object, lost in reality, is preserved as a spectre within the subject. The melancholic subject keeps the lost object within itself as an interior absence within the ego. Moreover, as Ferber clarifies, this loss is divorced from reality, as melancholy gives up the external world as a source for the construction of the self. In law, this same structure of melancholy is seen as law internalizes an absent ideal as the core of normative desire. Moreover, law's melancholy is defined by an unrequited desire for an idealized order that never emerges. After the rule is applied, there is still some remainder of normativity, which is never consumed by the act, Tacit tells us. This legal melancholy is thus not the mere description of a legal subject who happens also to be melancholic, but runs to the very structure of law and the legal subject itself. The law retains an image of a world as a utopian ideal, nurtured and maintained by the normative impetus of legality. Melancholy is thus an indispensable shadow. It is the very foundation of normativity. In Mooncop, we can frame this melancholy in terms of the legal subject specifically. In Gould's work, the legal subject appears as the absence of the individual within law's rational schema. Here on page 21 and pages 20 and 21 is one of the most powerful examples. In this figure is contained an array of 18 equally sized panels, a chocolate box of moments. These are arranged in a regular grid, alternately depicting the screen of the Mooncop's police computer and the Mooncop himself sat in his lunar room. As a cluster of nodes within the linear narrative, this figure presents the Mooncop completing his quarterly crime report. The Mooncop has encountered no crime and thus solved no crime, which results in an absolute solution rate of 100%. The bureaucratic form filling appears pointless, a meaningless gesture imposed by the sovereign authority back on Earth. Taken atemporally, the arrangement of the panels suggests a closed loop of this bureaucratic pointlessness. The frames showing the Mooncop himself form a complete circle, a loop of moments that articulates a never-ending narrative of data entry. In the visual parlance of legal emblems, an encompassing circle denotes universal absoluteness, an image of the whole world. On these pages, we thus see the Mooncop's entire world, locked in his cyclic existence of administrative labor. No escape, no junction in the timeline, no potential for breaking the eternity. Locked in this total closure, the database of separable units set out on this double page articulates the Mooncop's legal melancholy. The Mooncop taps in some data, his solution rate is 100%. He sits in silence by his lunar window. He taps again, his screen asks him for input. He stares blankly at it. The screen stares blankly at him. Tap, tap. No crimes reported, investigated, or solved. Shut down, send report, tap, tap, sitting. A montage emerges of his life on the lunar colony and the monotony of the office of Mooncop. One's eyes can move to any panel in any sequence and the logic holds. The perceptive movement of the reader can flit and linger as it pleases, and nowhere can it find escape. The comic subject, the individual holding the book and reading its pages, is thereby captured within this bureaucratic embrace along with the individual Mooncop himself. And the legal condition is shared between these two subjects, both constituted by an archive of inscriptions that delimits their possible encounters and meanings. But this encircled depiction is incomplete, alienated and reified from the living being of the individual who is subjectivated. This subjectivating divide is provocatively displayed here, in which we witness a simultaneous layering of living human and mooncop as subject. Like a judicial portrait, we see the living being in the images as well as their legally constituted office. In the database of law, the individual is categorized and defined by the texts, structures, and material phenomena of institutional legality, resulting in an imperfect copy of the individual that we call the legal subject. In these pages, the living individual on the moon, whose life runs along with the linear narrative from left to right and over the page, is divided from the idea of the mooncop that circulates atemporally within law's institutional structures, an endless and atemporal circulation emblematized by the circle of bureaucracy and the capture of the comic subject within the page layout. The legal subject is thus shown to be the absence of the individual. It is the empty office of the mooncop rather than its living inhabitant. Law's subject is found only within its categories. Distinct and divided from the real human, it is the faulty mirror image of the individual. The subject is the gap in the archive. It is lost within law's rational text, its maze of printed matter and bureaucratic protocols. The structures of legality hide the subject from its living counterpart, holding on to a normative form that is empty of reality. The melancholy of the subject is thus not derived from an individual instance of a melancholic individual who is also a subject. The mooncop is not a case of legal melancholy. Rather, these pages depict the subject as a loss that is held in the maze of legality, as the internalized absence of the living individual contained in the fiction of the subject. Even turning the page does not resolve this legal melancholy. Indeed, as the comic subject continues through the linear sequence, it is confronted with a full page image of the mooncop amidst a sea of inscription. After the mooncop has left his lunar base, he drives across the moon's surface in his police vehicle, and in Gould's rendering, the moon's surface is covered in the scribbles of power. In this figure, law's authority is rendered as arbitrary lines. As Derrida notes, the power of the mark increases with its degree of arbitrariness, since the power of writing rests upon the ability of its otherwise enigmatic marks to be deciphered and interpreted. The moon is thus within law's jurisdiction, within its textual articulation. Insofar as it is written, it is closed off from the real lunar surface, contained in law as its poor written copy, and thus as its absence. This written land can be seen across the 94 pages of Gould's work, in the various depictions of the lunar surface, and in contrast to the smooth, star-studded emptiness of the cosmic background. And the figure of mooncop in Moon Police Car within the sea of inscriptions is one that is braided throughout mooncop's archive. It is an emblem of the legal subject, its capture and separation from the outside of the legal order, signaled by the cosmic background as much as the unwritten surface of the moon behind and beneath the text. Indeed, it also indicates the lunar substrate of the scribbled lines of power. Like the simultaneous depiction of mooncop and individual, the written surface of the moon is here written on the surface of the moon, a disarmingly literal figure of law's divide from the world it regulates, with both mooncop and lunar surface being lost in the text, that is, retained as losses within the text. And this divide signals a lunar melancholy. For Freud, both mourning and melancholy incite work. The work of mourning involves the intricate disentangling of the ego from the lost object, such that the actual loss in reality is accepted within the ego and the subject can move forwards. The work of melancholy entails a similar intricate disentangling of ego and lost object, albeit maintained within the subject itself. In both cases, the work envisaged is the casuistic and detailed unfastening of the subject from the absent object. But law, with its normative drive, neither seeks nor achieves this disentanglement. It needs always to be both separated from and connected to reality. Law's melancholia signify a paradox, seeking always to represent the world both as it is, so it can be regulated, and as an idealized form, so it can be normalized. This representation presents the world not as something to be mourned, as a lost world to be worked past and forgotten, but as a world that must be remembered and upon which the absent ideal must be ceaselessly brought to bear. The scribble of law on the lunar surface in Mooncop captures this. The surface of the moon must be written, both in the sense of being accurately described and thus within law's jurisdiction, and in the sense of being prescribed as a normative reality. If the normative aspect of this paradox is Freudian in its melancholy, the descriptive aspect can be rendered in a more Benjaminian fashion, and indeed is rendered in Gould in a distinctly lunar melancholy. Lunar melancholy can be characterized in terms of the absence of diurnal life and the bustle of community, of a lunar subject who lives on a planet, a bare rock that is not able to sustain life. This lunar subject thus inhabits, if it inhabits one at all, a declining community, a dead or dying world. For Benjamin, melancholy is not a loss that is, however imperfectly, worked through, something retained due to a pathological arrest in the normal experience of mourning. Instead, it is a loss that is kept alive through representation, through the work of presentation and expression, instead of that of detachment. An extended quotation here from Ferber. The philosophical work of expression, the work that presents the object in its fullness, is also that which brings it to rest. A complete philosophical expression would mean exhausting and draining from life. In other words, presenting meaning does not imply endowing the object with life or rebuilding its ruins, but rather bringing to rest in completing the process of its extinction. Benjamin translates Freud's concerns into the field of meaning, reconfiguring the relation with the lost object such that the meaning becomes contingent upon retaining the loss instead of seeking to overcome it. It is the capture of the object in discourse, a process which gradually drains the object of life as discourse elaborates it in text. Left to run its course, this sad work results in a dead and lifeless world. All potential of life and potentiality in the object are lost at the end of the process. And this process is closely related to actualizing and securing meaning, which are both based in the cessation of life or its draining into congealed significance. This congealed significance, this production of a singular meaning without the possibility of reinterpretation, is the emptiness of the real once life is captured in the text. It is the cold rock of the planet once everything has been translated into the order of symbols. The substrate of the lunar surface once the scribbles of law have fully defined it. It is the empty moon devoid of life. On one level, this might be interpreted as being what remains of law after it achieves its unrequited dream of alignment between text and world. But the cold, dead rock of a lifeless planet is not the output of a normative system. It is the result produced by a descriptive one that necessarily drains life out of the world as it captures it. Just as law has its normative and descriptive aspects, it is concomitantly caught in a melancholic bind. Either it achieves its unrequited dream and collapses out of existence, or it has nothing to regulate because it destroys the world through an overdetermined work of description that leaves no room for the potency of life. Law thus maintains itself by hovering somewhere between these two extremes, as the oscillation between Freudian and Benjaminian melancholic work, between the elucidation of the general and the capture of the particular, between principle and instance, abstract rule and individual case. In this sense, law is made up of melancholia, legal and lunar. Mooncop does more than present a re-encoding of these two modes of melancholy. It does more than present an atemporal database of figures rendered with legal scribbles over dying rock. The linear narrative ends not with the dead residue of the moon, nor in the total abstraction of an empty and artificial subject. Instead, the enduring final moments depict individuals freed from the confines of legality. During his work, the Mooncop meets one of the original colonists. Now, as the colony dies and humanity recedes to Earth, she bemoans the hubris of trying to live on the moon. The Mooncop, meanwhile, believes the moon colony is amazing and reveals that he had always wanted to live on the moon. The moon for him is not a dead rock to be inhabited and scribbled on, but is itself a thing of beauty and meaning. It does not need to be described or regulated. Indeed, as we've seen, such things result only in sadness and death. Instead, it should be gazed at in silence, in the stillness of the night sky as the moon cop himself does on a regular basis, while eating donuts, because of course he is a cop after all. Despite the slow exodus from the moon, the gentle crisis of the failure of the colony, the moon's donut vending machine is upgraded with a staffed cafe. This upgrade comes with a new member of staff who joins the lunar colony as everyone else is leaving. By the final stages of the linear narrative, the moon cop and the new donut waitress are the only two people on the moon. Escaping the confines of legality and of writing, they depart their respective offices as cop, as donut seller, and drive into the lunar wilderness to gaze at the rugged beauty of the moon, with the earth floating amidst the sparkling firmament. As the colony shuts down and law gives up both its normative and descriptive efforts, the moon returns to float in space as something beyond description, beyond legality, beyond the edge of the world. What is left when the social order has abated is two individuals released from the confines of their socio-political roles. Their masks are lifted as the curtain falls on the theatre of governance, and they can gaze unimpeded on the universe. The moon is rendered as a space above or outside the earthly realm from which the marble of the planet can be seen adrift in the cosmos. It becomes that which is outside of law, outside the melancholia of norms and descriptive categories. And at the end of Mooncop's linear narrative, in the lowest reaches of its database of images, the Mooncop and donut seller sit within this exterior space, unnamed and without office. They drift in the endless night. Thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm still chairing, that's good. Cool. So that was my paper. And so our final paper for this session before we move to questions is Informed Consent and Dangerousness. Is it possible to control an unimaginable power? Renato Antonia Constantino Acaicho. I hope I didn't get that completely wrong. So Renato, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. Can everyone hear me fine? Yes, oh, great. Because, well, I come from Peru and I don't have that much of an audience to talk about graphic justice, comics, and law, and how they intervene. I'm trying to put in words what I usually do when giving my classes about disability rights. That's my background. So what I wanted to do is to put into words how does informed consent work in the real world, but also in the superhero world, and to talk about dangerousness, this idea that someone has to be put outside of the society because we cannot rely on the possibility that, because we cannot rely on them to control their own power, their own hubris, or their own chances to hurt themselves or someone else. Some previous concepts, I'm going to rely on the social model of disability, the idea that disability is not an inside condition, but actually surges from the interaction of a biological impairment and a social barrier. In this matter, usually the comic book that has been like the paradigm of this is X-Men. They usually talk about, even though I think it started talking about race and gender, usually I think that nowadays can be seen like people that have disabilities, and some of them are trying to be proud of those disabilities, and some of them are trying to look for a cure. And that has been usually one of the most common storylines in X-Men. Legal capacity, the idea that disability cannot be a ground for the restriction of legal capacity. Everybody has the right to do to make a decision. And prior informed consent, the idea that anyone can consent or reject medical treatment on their own. But now we have to approach dangerousness. And this is really interesting because the idea of dangerousness, or how someone is uncontrollable, usually comes from psychology. Foucault works a lot on the idea on how there's a normality standard. Someone has to be normalized. And those who are not normal or cannot be normalized are usually marginalized, are subject to mistreatment, to torture, or institutionalized. in the end, they are excluded from our society. But why does that happen? And I think that there's one of the most interesting interactions between law and psychology. Psychology provides the ground for the law to say who is normal and who can make a decision, and who is not normal and who cannot make a decision. So from Roman times, there's the idea that furiosi nulla voluntas est. The person that is mad doesn't have a real will, so we cannot rely on what they say. And we do it, and I think that psychology tries to give an explanation and a justification for this. We take the madman or the madwoman and say that they cannot make their own decisions to protect the others or to protect them from themselves. So how do we actually decide? We can rely on two main criteria. The best interest approach, we're going to take a decision for someone else because of their health or because of to protect their assets. And for example, I could, in the case of a person with a mental disability, decide that they are best positioned to go to a psychiatric institution and stay there forever. And that actually happens a lot in comic books. Like, and I think that the idea of Arkham Asylum, it's that these persons cannot be around us, so they should be excluded to the asylum. And the idea of will and preferences, the idea that we should try to rely on what they would have wanted if they could make the decision. Now, international human rights law doesn't have a final answer on what to do. I think that this is really interesting because there's no standard to compare. For example, there's a universalist approach that the CRPD committee defends, and they say that it's absolutely forbidden to permit substitute decision makers to provide consent. So persons with disability, even persons with psychosocial disabilities, have the right to provide consent, and they cannot be substituted for relatives or spouses. However, there are other positions in the European Court of Human Rights, and actually the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights also has said that there may be a specific and exceptional emergencies. And what I was thinking is what happens in comic books, because I do use this usually in my classes. Because madness is usually seen as criminal and dangerous, because it goes against the rationality of law. Law is usually this embodied by the idea of rationality of what should happen. However, madness can happen to anyone and not only villains. And actually, that's a pretty common storyline in comic books. How madness can happen, I think, and I'm thinking about from The Killing Joke, the idea that we're just one bad day away from total madness. And this madness is usually seen as criminal and dangerous. It doesn't matter if the person can actually make a decision about their madness, about going out of their mind. They should be treated as criminal and dangerous. However, this is a different dangerousness, because the dangerousness that psychiatry usually means is a harm to self, even suicide, which is serious, or a harm to others, even murder. However, in comic books, dangerousness may mean the destruction of planets and the alteration of reality. And so how should we take that approach into comic books? And what happens in comic books, from what I've been trying to take up, and I had two examples in mind, which were from X-Men, Jean Grey and Scarlet Witch. Scarlet Witch in House of M is usually treated against her will because she can alter reality. And in the end, she alters reality and eliminates a lot of mutants in the end. And we all know the idea of Jean Grey and how she can, awake the power of the Phoenix, this special cosmic force that can even destroy planets. And I also had another example in mind that came when I was developing this idea that from Umbrella Academy. And in Umbrella Academy, the character of Vanya Hargreaves is treated against her will and in secret by Reginald Hargreaves. So she doesn't know she has a power, just like Jean Grey doesn't know she has a power. So even though what forced treatment is a constant in comic books because it happens all the time, and probably Wolverine, it's one of the biggest examples, secret treatment is not that common. The idea that the person doesn't know that she has been through a treatment is not that common. And I think that it has to do with gender. Just like in real life, girls with disability are usually subject to forced treatment, mainly about reproductive health. They are usually sterilized against their will or without their will. They don't know that they have been sterilized. And the justification relies usually on the best interest approach. It's the best for Vanya not knowing that she has this power that can destroy planets. It's best for Jean Grey to not to know that she has this power. So they do these psychiatric treatments on them, the idea of mental blocks in the case of Jean Grey, or the idea of kind of a spell in the case of Vanya Hargreaves. Now, how do superheroes deal with this idea? So I'm gonna call this, this is from House of M. In House of M, superheroes just make a council and they decide what to do with her. And for example, Wolverine just proposes the idea of killing Scarlet Witch. They cannot have her alive because it's not possible. And the whole world, and it's over there, the whole world is in danger because of her. Then there's Captain America that says, there has to be a way. There's always a way, so we can do something else. In the end, as I mentioned before, Scarlet Witch just says, no more mutants, and the mutants, and many mutants have to go in the end of House of M. But I was also thinking about one of the latest storylines in X-Men, in which Jean Grey possesses Zorn, this special helmet that allows her to control the Phoenix. So she voluntarily decided to control this unimaginable power. And I was thinking that maybe these are all approaches to the idea of what we do in comic books, and how does this relate with the idea of psychiatry in real life? Because of the fear of an unimaginable power, we can create, I said 3 answers, like from outside and 1 from inside. Killing the person, that's the Wolverine approach. Forced treatment, which seems to be Captain American approach. Secret treatment while kids, which is also Professor Xavier and Hargreaves approach. And self-restraint. This would be what the CRPD committee would want, that the own person decides to control this power. It doesn't happen always. And actually, substitute this, but there's problems in both sides. Substitute decision-making is usually biased. For example, we have the case of Professor Xavier again, when he decided not to listen to the Danger Room. And the Danger Room was actually an alien and was looking for help. And however, Professor Xavier decided to control her power in order to have a place for the X-Men to train. So if this is biased, if self-restraint is dangerous, is it possible, realistic, or valid to look for informed consent in cases of unimaginable power? I'm not quite sure. I think that that it's really difficult, that the idea that in some cases we have kids and kids that have another parental figure that is not actually their parents, like the case of Jean Grey, like the case of Vanya Hargreaves, makes it quite difficult to decide if we should allow for informed consent or not. But if not, who gets to decide? It could be parents, it could be trainers, it could be as a special council of superheroes, or maybe it could be humanity as a whole. I think that it's difficult to point where do we want the decision to be. However, my experience dealing with persons with disability tries to rely on the possibility that they can make their own decisions. However, when the other side of when we're dealing with the idea that the world can be destroyed, I think this is kind of difficult, and we should try to think why are we afraid of the idea of unimaginable power, and if we can change that in any ways. So the idea of this presentation was actually just to present some problems with the idea of informed consent and how dangerousness works in a world of unimaginable power. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Renato. And thank you to all our other speakers as well. Okay, so we've got like 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so for questions. So I'll just open the floor and see if anybody has any questions they would like to ask of any of our speakers. Yeah, Tim.
Thank you for such a fantastic panel, and it's heading towards 2 a.m. my time. So if I'm incoherent, I'm going to blame it on that. But I was actually struck by the way in which the papers kind of actually spoke to each other, particularly around the notion of the institutionality of law. And the being within or outside of law. And obviously that's explicit in Thom's paper, and there's sort of an articulation of the way in which the subject is sort of caught within or captured within a law, but a law that seems to be sort of fading away because it's lost its institutional basis in the socio-political framework. And of course the whole framework of statelessness is about, not so much law having faded away, but law being there, but having excluded particular people from either intentionally or unintentionally from that capturing of the legal subject. And then for Renato, it's not so much the capturing of the subject within law, but it's the pivot point of the exercise of legal subjectivity, which is the notion of informed consent, which you seem to be sort of trying to think through in terms of are these people, persons with disabilities, or these superheroes with incredible abilities, can we capture them within a traditional notion of informed consent as a legal subject that's exercising sort of their will. Potentially incoherent comments that are trying to tie the papers together. One point for Thom, though, which is that the emblem of the donut with the absent center, is that actually, is that escape at the end, or is it simply actually being recaptured within law and its absent center, the loss that you sort of been, the melancholy keeps looking for. So yes, so I don't know if there's any of those are helpful, but trying to bring the papers together.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Does either of those set of speakers have anything to respond to Tim with?
I think it was more of a comment. I'm sorry, Amal, if you raise your hand. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Amal?
I think that
you start, Renato. I can come in after you.
Okay, so Renato and then Amal.
Well, okay. Well, I think that the idea of an institutionalized law So if every space must have a law, I think it's really difficult to point how this idea of the unimaginable power works. And I think that we should try to create the idea that there has to be a law for this kind of cases, but that law could not be that separate from what the real law looks like. And the criteria to make a decision in one case should be similar to the criteria to make the decision in the other way. I don't know if that was like what you meant with your comment, but now I'm leaving for Amal.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that from the perspective of our paper, and Tim, I think that's more coherent at 2 a.m. your time than I'm going to be at 3:30 p.m. my time. Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at statelessness as a phenomenon and look at it from the perspective of being within or outside the law, or as a legal strategy to include or exclude people, is another way of looking at it. It actually results in quite a fascinating kind of analysis and study of various ways in which the law is used as a tool to deny people access to rights and to exclude people. And beyond that, the way the law is used as a narrative to justify that exclusion. So it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby you have groups who are denied nationality, and by denying them their nationality, then their connection to their country is denied. And then their history is challenged. And then that is used as a basis to cast them as outsiders and justify the discrimination that you mete out to them. So it's this reinforcing kind of cycle. And if you look at the Rohingya community, for example, who are a stateless minority from Myanmar, that's exactly what has happened to them. Myanmar has deprived them of their citizenship, then said they are not Burmese, they are Bangladeshi, therefore we don't owe them anything, therefore we will not give them rights and we will drive them out, etc. And it's that kind of cyclical nature which really we need to, from the perspective of activism or advocacy, that we need to try and kind of break down. And a lot of it is to do with the law, but a lot of it is also to do with narratives, which is why I mean, bring it back to the theme of this conference. It's so important to find other ways of kind of engaging with people and addressing these quite damaging narratives.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both. I'll just respond quickly as well. Yeah, I was also struck particularly with the first presentation on the Shapeless Shapes about the way it really engaged with the kind of constitutive narrative of law and the role that has in like quite significant things about like people's kind of very kind of existential status in a way in relation to the institution, and also how that crossed over with some of the stuff I was talking about in relation to the kind of idea of the subject as the kind of shape that law gives to individuals. And so the idea of the shapeless shape in some ways is the idea of the individual or the being that is kind of outside of legality in some way, that the institution seeks to kind of draw a shape around so that it can define and govern. But then that exclusion then becomes a mode of governance as well, right? So that's really interesting. Tim's question about the donut. It's a really good question, actually. So my instinctive response is that the donut is part of the institution of COP, right? So it kind of symbolizes the kind of absent center of the inhabitant of the office of COP is symbolized in the donut with the hole in the middle, right? Or jam, which is a kind of absence of donut. Quite what that signifies for my overall argument, I'm unsure, but I will have to go and buy some donuts to research at length what the significance of that might be. So thank you. Okay. Anybody else got any questions for any of our panelists or to build on any of the discussion we've had so far? Yes, Stacey.
I don't know if this is going to be helpful. This is a little bit more of a comment, but particularly the first two papers, what sort of came to mind, because you have this sense that law is abandoning people either onto the moon or abandoning a project on the moon or abandoning citizenship, taking it away from people. I do a lot of work in my other scholarship on the stateless in Bahrain, which I'm sure the presenters are familiar with, even though you didn't necessarily cite that. But there's been hundreds of people in the last couple of years whose statelessness has been removed. Anyway, one of the things that I've recently been looking at with a number of other scholars who study the Middle East and statelessness is the application of Giorgio Agamben's States of Exception in 2005. And maybe this is more of a question or a comment for Thom, who's taking a very theoretical approach. I'm wondering if that would be useful, because obviously it's a really complicated set of theories that he puts forward, but I think the thrust of it, at least in my reading, is that the law contains its own unraveling. Like the legal regime, even in putting forward a positive law, always has that state of exception at the ready. And so that's the potential emptiness that legal regimes can pull away pretty much without consequence in the way that things are set up, as a sort of implicit state of affairs. And so I'm just wondering if that might be useful with any of these papers.
So Amal, did you want to respond first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely there's a lot that we can draw from Agamben. And I mean, the other much more controversial, if you go back a few decades, a much more controversial philosopher is Schmidt. And of course, his kind of whole theory of the exception and the idea that the norm exists because of the exception, and the executive is the person who can declare the exception and kind of utilize their powers to do so. And I think, I mean, the situation in Bahrain, for those of you who are less familiar with what's happening there, but also in a number of other countries, it really speaks to this problem where basically the state has very loosely defined laws at its disposal and extensive discretion to deem people as acting counter to the national security interest or counter to national interest even more generally. And therefore the state has the ability to strip them of their citizenship with no real legal right to appeal. And we work with a number of activists, some of them based in the UK, who are victims of this process. And so the absolute power that the state holds there to instrumentalize nationality, I think it's deeply problematic. And particularly when you kind of strip it back to, at least in the context of a democracy, a state's legitimacy derives from citizens voting a government into power. So the idea that a government once voted into power by those whose existence justify it actually being so, can then shape the citizenry by excluding those who, for some reason or other, it doesn't like, or who are opposed to it. Thereby, it's actually a way of grabbing power and holding on to it. And it's probably one of the most undemocratic acts that a state can engage in. So yeah, absolutely, Agamben and also Schmidt, I think there's a lot for us to unpack and learn from there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I've got much to add to that. I mean, the figure of the outcast is quite a significant one for Agamben, as well as the idea of the outside being contained within the definition of the inside. It's the kind of distinctive Agambenian thing. I'm sure Tim can say a lot more about Agamben than I can. Does anyone have anything further? Maxime, you raised your hand briefly.
Yeah, can everybody hear me? It's my microphone. Yeah, okay. Thank you for the presentations. This question is for Amal and Hanna, but well, I thought of it after your presentation, but it's maybe something to answer for other speakers as well. I was thinking of the translation and language that you were talking about, from more difficult and complex language to understandable and accessible language. And I was thinking that is something that happens with legal language a lot. There's always a lot of people need maybe a language mediator or a translator for the difficult legal language to transfer onto maybe more everyday understandable language. And I my question is sort of twofold, I think. Is there a certain language, when you were translating it to more everyday, accessible language, were there certain language things or ways that people talk about statelessness that stood out for you, that was something where you felt, okay, this is how we speak of that in a language, linguistic kind of sense? And maybe the second part of that question would be, how do you feel that the accessibility, or maybe the lack of accessibility, of legal language affects either, or maybe social language even, that's maybe also a part of that, affects stateless people, or the way that we think about statelessness in our contemporary sense?
Hanna, do you want to start? Since I've already answered, and as you have the benefit of coming from a non-legal perspective, I can then add to whatever you say.
Yeah, I think the idea of translation is just so important to me as someone who, you know, is not an expert, but is hoping to, you know, really bring these issues to the surface and really widen its audience. So, you know, Shapeless Shapes was one way of doing that. I think for me, I was largely kind of working by myself in the beginning, and thinking about statelessness and trying to understand it myself. And the way that I arrived at this idea of a Shapeless Shapes was because just the sound of stateless was really similar to shapeless in my mind. And from there, I kind of like worked my way backwards to thinking about what it means to deny the most basic human rights to humans, and statelessness being a tool for kind of normalizing that. And I don't know if I'm really answering your questions, but I do want to talk about how this one stateless woman that saw my book, you know, she said the two words Shapeless Shapes really described how she'd been feeling inside. And, you know, I think that really gave me a lot of confidence that the translation is actually really important, and it actually makes people feel heard. So yeah, I'll just stop there and let Amal kind of finish up my unorganized thoughts.
No, just to add to that, I mean, I think coming at this from a legal perspective, I think it's so easy for us in whatever field, academia, a particular discipline, whatever it is, to just fall into this trap of, you know, getting comfortable with our own jargon, and then we just don't speak beyond the little bubble that we have around us. And I think this also, particularly in the legal field and in the human rights field, where there's a lot of advocacy with diplomats and in kind of at the Palais des Nations in Geneva and with UN agencies. It's both the jargon combined with the absolutely sterile context in which some of these discussions take place, which collectively it kind of strips words of their meaning. And you find that you're just kind of saying things without fully digesting what they mean or appreciating the real life implications of the experience of people whose kind of life you're describing, or who you're supposedly advocating on behalf of. So I think an exercise like this, it really forces you to confront the way you use language and to strip it down to the bare minimum that's necessary to articulate what you want to articulate. And also because it was a combination of words and images, and a lot of the book is conveyed through Hanna's beautiful and really powerful images. It was also about, so my task was finding words which didn't dominate, but which actually kind of complemented Hanna's images. And that also, I think there's a certain humility which comes with that. And you realize actually this is not about your words, it's about the whole product. And I think this goes to what Hanna said also about kind of collaboration as an artist and compromise in that sense, not necessarily being a weakness. So that's a bit of a roundabout way of saying, I think absolutely there are problems with the way we speak about things as experts, as people speaking in particular bubbles, and we need to challenge ourselves to break out of that.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got about 5 minutes or so left, if anybody has anything further.
I just have a quick comment on Renato's paper. I really enjoyed how seriously you took the X-Men, and you had me thinking about something that I think if you were to develop the scholarship further, I think the piece that could be really helpful in terms of linking comic books to issues of consent and control is that notion, and you alluded to sort of the violence in self-regulation, right? Because ideally we think maybe a normative sense in a lot of societies, if we can get people to self-regulate their disabilities and come up with a management tool, right, to engage with the larger social world, or in the case of the X-Men, if somebody can control their powers. But is there a violence associated just with that hope or expectation? And I think comic books could be really good for that, because there's so many storylines now that I'm reflecting within superhero comics about that problem of self-regulation. I mean, I'm thinking of just the Incredible Hulk is a whole character based on that issue. Anyway, I just thought that piece of it might be really, really excellent to focus in on a paper. And so I just wanted to encourage you to go further.
Thank you. I will. Can you? I'll write you so you can send me the actual text, maybe. I didn't hear the title.
Oh, I was just talking about the character of the Incredible Hulk in general.
Oh.
You know, I mean, but my point is just that there's so many examples. I mean, I'm happy to send you some that I can think of, but I feel like in the superhero genre, you would find so many. And it's a little bit of like what I haven't read everything, but I feel like that's like a new territory for comic scholars to think about self-regulation and social regulation of difference, whether it's disability or power, or however you frame it. I think that's a good avenue. We could really benefit from that within like the comic scholar world. So good job.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. So I just realized I've misread the program and we should have finished 5 minutes ago. So there you go. The next session starts at 3:55 UK time. So in about 5 minutes time. So we've got a short break to grab whatever you need, a power nap or a cup of coffee. And then we're going into the breakout room. So hopefully you have allocated yourself via Christiana to one of those rooms. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of the other speakers for this session and all of your engagement. It's been a very exciting session. So thank you very much.